Hi, in this episode we're going to take a look at how you can automate data refreshes from a Google Sheet into Power BI. In the last episode we already took a look at how you can automate a data refresh from an Excel on SharePoint Online using Power Automate. But within Power Automate we don't have a trigger for a Google Sheet, so we need to look for a different solution. And for that we will use Google Apps scripts and the Power BI API. So let's take a look at how you can set this up. I have created a sample Google Sheet with a simple table containing some product sales. And we're going to start by creating a new Power BI report and importing that. Let's head over to Power BI, click on Get Data, and then we need to find our data source. It's not listed in the common data sources, so we'll go to More. And then we're going to look for Google Sheets. Here I can see the Google Sheets connector. Select it and click on Connect. Click on Continue. And now I need to enter my Google Sheets URL. I'm going to copy the URL from my Google Sheets, paste it in the URL here, click on OK. Then it's going to prompt me to sign in. Click on Sign In. It's going to redirect you to the authentication page of Google. I log in with my account. So I've successfully authenticated, and then I can go back to Power BI. And I can see I've now been correctly signed in. Click on Connect. Here is my Sheet 1 containing my table. I can see I still need to do a small transformation to make sure that the first line are actually the table headers. So let's select Sheet 1 and go through the transform data. And then we'll say use first row as headers. I can see it has already applied the correct transformations for what I need. So text column and a numeric value. Click close and apply to load in that data. My data has now been correctly loaded. Let's just visualize it. I have my products and my sales. I'll put them in a simple table. This is a correct representation of my data. Then we're going to publish it to the Power BI online service. Let me create a new workspace for it. Workspaces, let's create a new workspace called Google Sheets. Apply. Workspace has been created. We'll then also publish our reports. And I will publish it to our Google Sheets workspace. Let's see if it's correctly published. We'll refresh the workspace page, and then I can see that my report has been loaded. Let's take a look at our connection to make sure that we can refresh it with the API. Here in the workspace, you click on the scheduled refresh button. And what we want to achieve is that we will not rely on the scheduled refresh to periodically check for new changes, but we want to enable some mechanism that it will automatically update our data set. It will refresh our data set whenever there is a change in the underlying data source. But for the API to be able to refresh that data set, it needs to be able to connect to our Google Sheets. And we were able to do that from our desktop site, but we also need to enable it for the online service. So you can see that alert icon where it says that it has failed to test the connection. So we're going to click on Edit Credentials. The authentication method here is OAuth2, and I'm gonna leave the privacy level setting on none and click on Sign In. And then again, we need to authenticate with our Google user. I'm gonna give it permission. And now our Google Sheets data source has been updated. Just to be sure that the refresh is fully functional, I'll go back to the workspace and click on Refresh. There is no new data in our Google Sheets, so it will not make a change on the report, but it's just to test if it can pull in the new data there. So let's just check here. It has done the refresh. Let's check here with the scheduled refresh. If we then go to refresh history, I can see there was an on-demand refresh and it has successfully completed. So now we know that the Power BI online service can connect to our Google Sheet and pull in the data successfully. The next step will be to enable some kind of a mechanism that whenever there is a change in my Google Sheet, that it will trigger that automatic data refresh. And to do that, we can use Google App Scripts. So if we go back to our Google Sheet and then under extensions, there is App Scripts. So here we're gonna program some functionality that whenever there is a change in my data of my Google Sheet, it will trigger a refresh of the Power BI dataset or Power BI semantic model. And we will do that by calling the Power BI API. And to be able to use that API, we need to register an application within the Azure Entra ID or the Azure Active Directory. And we can do that within the Azure portal. So to get to the Azure portal, you browse through portal.azure.com, and then you're going to look for Microsoft Entra ID. If you don't see it here under the most common Azure services, you can also go to the search, and then you'll look for Entra, and then you'll see Microsoft Entra ID. Okay. So when you are within Entra ID, you expand Manage, and then you go to App Registrations. Then we're gonna create a new registration. I'll call it Power BI API Refresh. Who can use this application? Accounts in this organizational directory only, so that's the recommended one. Only users within our tenant can use it. Then we also need to set the redirect API if we want to. I'll set it to web, and then just put in a demo value HTTPS, and I will point it to the local host. Then we'll register that app registration. And once we have completed the app registration, there are two elements that we need to copy over. That's the application or client ID, and then the directory or the tenant ID. Now we also need to create a client secret. Then we go to certificates and secrets, and we need to create a new client secret. We're gonna call our secret Google Sheets, and then we need to set an expiration date. So the longest one, you can also put a longer one, but we'll just keep it here on 6 months, which is the default value, which is just fine. So it means that this credential will remain valid for 180 days, and then you need to refresh that credential. So depending on your setting, just make sure that you put a reminder in your agenda that a few days before you will go back to the portal, refresh the credential, and also update your code. Let's click on Add. Then quite important, we'll see here the secret ID and then the value. And the value is actually like the password for that particular credential, and that it will only be visible the first time when you create that client credential. So don't forget to copy it and put it in a text document, because if you forget to do it, then you will have to recreate a new client secret, because it's only visible the first time when you have just created that client secret. Once we have created our client secret, then we also need to set the permissions. So with the credentials that we have just created, which types of APIs can it connect to? Go here on the left to API permissions, and then we're going to add a permission and give it access to Power BI. Then I have the Microsoft APIs here, and then we're going to select the Power BI service. We're going to pick the delegated permission, and the permissions that we need to add is datasets, and then dataset. We're going to give it read-write all access. So we're going to add this permission, and then we're also going to add a permission here as well on the reports. So let's look for it. Reports. So report read all, we're also gonna enable. Now these permissions have been added, and we're gonna grant it the admin consent. Okay, now our permissions are all set, so we should be good to go to start programming that logic in our Google Apps script. To add a Google Apps script, we go back to our Google Sheets, and then we're going to go to Extension Apps Script, open it up, and then we have a new project. Let's call it Power BI Data Refresh. Power BI Data Refresh. And then we need to write our function. I already have my codes here. I will add a link in the description of the video to a web page where you can also just copy paste this piece of code. There are a couple of things that we need to enter here. So first of all, we need to get our tenant ID that we get from the Entra ID portal. So we're going to go back to our app registration here. So we go to overview, then we have the tenant ID that we need to copy. Let's put that here. Then we need to get our client ID. That's this one. We need to get that client secret that we have stored in our text document before. Let's copy that over and make sure to keep those credentials confidential. So now everything looks fine. And just to walk you through the logic a little bit, what it will first do here is this function will get a Power BI token. So it will first get an access token for the Power BI API. So it will use our credentials just to get that access token. It's gonna connect to the API, and that token is only valid for about 1 hour. So that's why we have this function in there. If you were just to create that bearer token manually and put it in there, then you will need to maintain it continually. So we need to have a function to get an access token. And then we also have a function to do the actual refresh. So what it's going to do here is, first of all, get that token so that it can authenticate, and then based on these settings, it's going to trigger a refresh of that data set. So we've already configured all the details for our API to get that access token, and then we just need to point it to the right workspace and dataset ID. So let's open the workspace, and then here from the URL I can copy that workspace ID, put that here, and then I also need to get my dataset ID. So I'll go here to my semantic model, then copy over that dataset ID, put it in there, and then everything here should be fine. So we're gonna deploy this project, say a new deployment, select a deployment type. It's gonna be a web app. Let's name it Power BI Data Refresh. It's gonna execute as the current user who has access to this automation. That you need to set a little bit depending on how you have configured your Google Sheet. If it's something that you are just maintaining yourself, you can keep it on only myself. If you have other people within your organization with access to it, then you can also extend the scope a little bit. Here I will just keep the scope to myself and then deploy that app script. Now I need to authorize the access. Click here, sign in with my user account. Google hasn't verified this app, so it's an additional safety step to say like, okay, are you really sure that you want to deploy this custom code that Google hasn't verified? We're fine with that, so we're gonna continue. So you click on advanced and then say yes. We're gonna proceed and then allow this script to run. Now my deployment has successfully been updated. I'm gonna click on done. Okay, so let's do a test of that code to see if it all functions. I need to set it to the function I want to execute. So I'm gonna go here and select the onEdit trigger. So that is the actual trigger whenever there is a change to my Google Sheet that it will execute, and that in its turn will call the refresh Power BI dataset. This one will call my function to get my access token, and then once it has successfully obtained that access token, it will call the Power BI API and give the instruction to refresh that dataset. So we'll start from that first entry point, the onEdit trigger. Let's click on Run. I get a 403 error. Okay, so something that I forgot to do is to add the Power BI app registration that we have created here, to add it as a user to our workspace. We'll go back to the Google Sheets workspace, go to Manage Access, click on Add People or Groups, and then we're going to search based on the name of the app registration. So this one was Power BI API Refresh. Go here, Power BI API Refresh, select on this one. I'm going to give it admin access to this workspace. Click on Add. We're going to go back to our Google App Scripts and see now we got this error, this 403 error, which means there was an authentication error. Let's see if we can now execute it successfully. Let's close the debugger and run it again. My execution has started. Let's resume. I still get an authentication or a permission error. Let's check our Power BI tenant settings. We go here to settings and then go to the admin portal. Then I have my tenant settings, and then we'll search for service principal. Service principals can use Fabric APIs or Power BI APIs. So that's enabled. Yes, that looks fine. So web apps registered in Microsoft Entra ID can use the service principals rather than user credentials to authenticate against the API. So that's enabled. That's all okay. I need to update my resource there. Debug it. Perfect. Now everything is in place for our code to execute correctly. So let's test an execution manually. Let's click on Run. The execution has started and completed. And then we should see a refresh to be triggered in the Power BI service. Let's go back to our workspace. Let's refresh my page. Go to my scheduled refresh, go to my refresh history, and then I can see here a refresh through the API, and that has been successfully completed. Now that we know that the code is functioning correctly, we also need to set a trigger. We already have a function here, the onEdit trigger, but it's not gonna run by itself. We first need to go to triggers here and then add a new trigger. We're gonna execute the onEdit trigger. Then I also need to set my event type. I'm gonna pick the onEdit one. There are two quite similar ones. You have the onEdit and the onChange. The onEdit is whenever you have new content, for example, a cell update. The onChange is more for structural changes. For example, I added new rows, new columns in there. But this one, the onEdit one, is gonna pick up new data being created or being changed. And then you can also pick which type of failure notification you want to have. Do you just want to get a daily summary, or do you immediately want to get a message? It's up to you. I'm just gonna keep it on notify me daily. Click on save. Need to authenticate again. It's like before giving me a warning that Google hasn't verified this application. That's fine. It's something that we have created. We're going to allow access to it. Now that we have the trigger in place, we're going to alter our data set. So we're going to create a new product in here. product D with 3,000 in sales, product E with 4,000 in sales. Now it's saving my Google Sheets automatically. And then if we go back here to our project, we should also see the project being executed, and we can see a bit of an error in there. So let's go to the executions. And then what you see there is that it has given me an error because there is a refresh already running. So that's a bit of the downsides here. Maybe we need to set a delay there. Yes. Yeah. So what we saw is that we got some errors here because refreshes are happening too rapidly. When I change a couple of cells, after first cell, it will immediately fire that dataset refresh. And then when I update the second cell, it's firing that refresh trigger again, but my Power BI dataset is still in the process of being refreshed. So that's too fast consecutively. So let's see if we can update our script to mitigate this problem. So I'm gonna change my trigger and add some additional functionality in there. So what I will now do is to make sure that there is a cooldown period of 5 minutes. So whenever I have new changes coming in there, it will wait until a 5-minute period has been passed. But what I also need to make sure is that when there are new changes within that cooldown period, I still want to get them in my Power BI refresh at some point. So it's also going to keep track if there are new changes, and then my cooldown period has passed, it will then trigger a new refresh. I'm gonna save this project to my drive and then deploy it, do a new deployment. That's done. So let's take a look and see if this adapted logic now behaves correctly and we don't get any failures anymore. We'll go to our executions. We can see the last failed ones around 127. Go back to our product sales and add some new data in there. So I'll see, I have a typo there. Product E, product F. 4,500 in sales, product G, 5,000. So that should trigger a couple of consecutive change requests. Let's go back to our execution here. And then we can see here there are now different executions of that trigger, but we don't get the failure anymore. So let's first of all take a look at our at our Power BI workspace. Go here to the workspace, check the scheduled refresh, the refresh history. So you can see this one has been successfully completed. Take a look at the report, my Google Sheets report. And then I can see here my products have been correctly transferred, so everything is working fine. So this is how you set up a automatic refresh of your Power BI dataset or Power BI semantic model based on a trigger in Google Sheets. I hope you got some value from this episode, and I'll see you in the next one.